Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second Asia Global Institute Public Policy webinar. I'm Hei Tang, Associate Director of the Asia Global Institute. The AGI Public Policy webinar series is a new webinar series organized by the Asia Global Institute. It aims to bring in leading academics and scholars from universities and think tanks around the world to present current research on global public policy issues and discuss their implications for Asia and the world. The speaker today is Professor Deborah Bräutigam from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She's going to talk about China and debt trap diplomacy, fact or fiction. Professor Deborah Bräutigam needs no introduction. She's the Bernard Schwartz Professor of Political Economy and Director of the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Her most recent books include The Dragon's Gift, which you cannot see it, which I suggest you to buy right now if you're interested in a China-Africa economic relationship, as well as Will Africa Feed China, which is about China's new engagement in Africa related to agricultural performance in the region. Before joining School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins in 2012, Deborah Bräutigam has taught at Columbia University for many years. Her teaching and research focus on international development strategies, governance, and foreign aid. She has twice won the Fulbright Research Award and is a recipient of fellowships from the Council on Foreign Relations, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and research grants from the UK Economic and Social Research Council. She has served as a consultant for Transparency International, the United Nations, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, among many others. Obviously, she has provided commentary to many newspapers and magazines, including the Financial Times, the New York Times, and many others. Without further ado, I'm going to let Professor Bräutigam to speak for about half an hour about her recent research on debt diplomacy, followed by around half an hour of Q&A. Throughout the webinar presentation, please feel free to type in your questions. In the last half an hour, I will try my best to direct most of your questions to Professor Bräutigam. Professor Bräutigam, please.
Thank you, Hei, for that introduction. And thank you to AGI for inviting me to speak to you. I know it's morning in Hong Kong. It's 9 o'clock at night where I am here near Washington, DC. So let's start. If you've heard anything about China's overseas lending over the last few years, you've undoubtedly heard the term Chinese debt trap diplomacy. China, we are told, inveigles poor countries into taking out loan after loan to build expensive infrastructure that they can't afford and that will yield few benefits. This, we're told, is done with the goal of Beijing ultimately taking control of strategic assets and infrastructure. You may have read also that Chinese banks are largely responsible for Africa's debt crisis by giving high interest loans that have to be refinanced every few years. Now, all of these stories swirling around in the media and on the internet, and sometimes being told by public policy figures, fit with a paradigm that we, particularly here in Washington, can call malign China. And on the other hand, you might have also read that China's Belt and Road Initiative is win-win for all concerned, that debt write-offs by China are common, and that China is, as a piece in Forbes magazine said, a free money machine. A Zambian economist told The Guardian, Chinese debt can easily be renegotiated, restructured, or refinanced. And China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been saying for years, China never presses countries in difficulty for debt repayment. So this is the paradigm of benign China. So as usual, the real story is somewhere in between. China's overseas lending presents substantial risks, and it can be lose-lose. Lending and investment, even foreign aid, delivered in risky environments always faces risks, and it always faces the chances of a failed project. The pandemic has exacerbated all of this. Yet the evidence that we've analyzed on Chinese lending suggests that the fear is overblown. The level of vehemence is not matched by the evidence of malfeasance. I've been doing intensive forensic multi-method research on China's overseas lending since 1983. I've written 3 books on Chinese lending and business engagement in Africa. I established the China-Africa Research Initiative in 2014 as a mini think tank inside Johns Hopkins University. And I want to take a few minutes here to show you one of our crown jewels, our public interactive database on Chinese loans. So let me get that up. And there. So this is a database that we launched last year. It has over 1,000 Chinese loans just in Africa, so we haven't gone globally yet. And if you see how it works here, if you hover over a country, take Ethiopia, for example, it tells the amount of loans, the number of loans there. If you tap on it, you can see at the bottom from the year 2000 to the year 2019, where the loans, which loans the years appeared. And if you look over to the right here, if we tap on, say, Kenya, these are the sectors that Kenya borrowed for: transport, electric power, multi-sector, water, and so on. So each of the countries in our database shows up in the map, darker if they've borrowed a lot from China, and lighter if they've borrowed very little from China, or nothing at all, as in the case of Libya. In the right-hand side over here is our list of all of the loans. This goes on for about 1,000 different loans. You can see these are the different hundreds of loans that the Angolans have borrowed, and hundreds of projects that have been financed by Chinese loans. We can look at all of the different countries. You can look at the years, the different sectors, and the other fields. And all of the data can be downloaded here in an Excel sheet, which includes not only the information here, but things like the different interest rates, the sectors, the borrowers, the lenders, and so on. So there's a lot of data in here. And just as a, let's see, we go back to stop share. So what we find in this Africa data, in any case, is that over 70% of China's lending is focused on economic infrastructure. That's roads, bridges, railways, electric power, telecoms, and water. Those are the dominant things. And there are, as I said, over 1,000 projects in that database, and some are going to be white elephants, and some will be failures. And infrastructure is notorious for corruption, which is another issue. I think that's quite a legitimate and often voiced complaint about Chinese lending. But with the 10 billion or so that China provides each year over the past few years, the infrastructure funding gap in Africa is still enormous. It's from $50 to $100 billion a year in unmet infrastructure funding needs. And all of the roads and bridges, electricity projects, they're widely considered to be essential for Africa's economic development and for bridging the digital divide. And Africa is, for the Chinese, it's an important market for their construction companies. Africa makes only about 4% of China's export market, but it's over 30% of their global construction market. So the focus of our research has been at 2 levels. The first has been understanding the dimensions of China's lending and its role in the debt profiles of borrowers in Africa and elsewhere in the developing world. And the second is how Beijing and its multiple Chinese lending entities coordinate and negotiate debt relief in Beijing's distressed borrowers. And this involves analysis among China's fragmented authoritarian bureaucracy in Beijing, and also at the country level in Sri Lanka, Zambia, Angola, and so on. So I'm going to share my screen again here. So this is just a quick snapshot of the data that we have in Africa. And as you can see, Angola is in red here, and Angola has gotten over 30% of China's loans between 2000 and 2019. So it's quite an outlier in the data. And if we look here at the international debt statistics, it's interesting to see this data comes from the World Bank here. This is public and publicly guaranteed debt on a global basis. So what we see here is that China actually makes up 5% of global debt in 2019. And bondholders made up 50% of global debt. Multilateral was 22%. Other non-official lending, which is mostly commercial banks and entities, about 14%. If we look just at Africa, we can see again, China's at 13% of all lending, bondholders 27%, and the multilaterals are the largest group at 32%. So China's a significant factor, but they're not the largest lender in either of these groups here. And if we look here this is external debt to GDP ratio, and then debt to China as a percent of all of the total external debt in 2019. These are just the low income and includes Angola as well, but the low income countries that were eligible for the G20's debt service suspension initiative, the DSSI. And what we have here is the red ones are currently in debt distress, and the orange ones are at high risk of debt distress, and the blue ones were in neither category there. Chinese lending made up a big chunk of the Republic of Congo, Djibouti, Angola, and Zambia in particular. They were significant in Cameroon, Ethiopia, and Kenya as well. So that's the group of countries that we keep seeing in the news. That's where the Chinese lending really is a big part of the problem. But in most of the rest of Africa, it really isn't the Chinese that we have to look at as a source of debt distress. So, a big part of our research has been looking into case studies of what happens when China's borrowers experience debt distress. And the first case that I'm going to tell you about in some detail is one that I wrote about recently with my colleague Meg Rithmeyer at Harvard Business School. And it's the case of the Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka. This is something that both Meg and I have spent a couple of years digging into, and some, as one friend says, forensic detail. So we've written about it briefly, but both Meg and I have written about it separately. It's a fascinating case. And I'm going to tell you about it by, first of all, just telling you a little bit of a story. So it begins once upon a time. Once upon a time, not so very long ago, a large and wealthy country arrived in Sri Lanka that was then embroiled in a 25-year civil war. Your poorest province is close to such important shipping lanes, representatives from this large and wealthy country said. This is such a strategic location. We think you can develop a major port. Our leading engineering and construction firm will do the feasibility study for you for free. Many in Sri Lanka were uneasy about this arrangement, and it was much debated, but eventually they agreed, despite the controversies. A year later, the study was delivered. We think you should build the port, this large and wealthy country said. It's clearly feasible. It'll cost about 1.2 billion, but don't worry about the finance. We have a plan detailed in the report for how this can be a win-win outcome. I'm sure you know which port we're talking about here. This is, of course, Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka. And the large and wealthy country with the eager interest in building a major port in a strategic backwater in a country struggling with a bloody civil war. It was Canada. Yes, it was Canada. The story of China's investment in Hambantota Port actually begins with Canada more than 20 years ago in 1999. And why was Canada interested in building a port in this backwater in Sri Lanka? Because it would have been a hugely lucrative $1.2 billion contract for SNC-Lavalin, Canada's largest overseas construction firm. And the Canadian government was working to support the interests of its large firms. So as often happens, a parliamentary election and a leadership shuffle in Sri Lanka got in the way of Canada's pursuit of this project. When the project was revived in 2020, 2005, after yet another election, one of China's largest companies, China Harbor, went after the contract. And then it was the Chinese government that supported the business interests of its large firm. The Canadians had recommended a joint venture, a public-private partnership, a BOOT model. But Sri Lanka, despite having very little experience, decided to try to operate this major new port by themselves when the first phase was completed. And this was a disaster, frankly. With ports, you can't just build them and then hope the business will come. International shipping doesn't work that way. And in 2015, when yet another election brought a new government to power, Sri Lanka was facing a balance of payments crisis due mostly to expensive Eurobonds, which made up 40% of the country's debt. The new government had little commitment to a port that had been a pet project of the former president, and that as a large greenfield investment would likely not turn a profit for at least a decade. So it decided to follow the original Canadian plan and create a public-private partnership, leasing the port to a new joint venture. When China Merchants Port bought the majority of the shares, the port finally took on the public-private partnership form that the Canadians had devised all those years ago. So how did Meg and I know all this about Canada? It wasn't easy research, actually. It took filing a Freedom of Information Act with the Canadian government, which took 1.5 years to bear fruit. And we finally got the files late last year. There were 1,000 pages of the entire archives of the Canadian correspondence on this Hambantota project, along with the feasibility study, which clearly said that the project was feasible. Meanwhile, in 2018, a hawkish Indian pundit wrote an op-ed about the Hambantota and coined the term debt trap diplomacy. He implied that the whole fiasco had been orchestrated by Beijing from the beginning. Weaponizing debt was hardwired into China's Belt and Road Initiative, he argued. And this interested reporters at the New York Times who interviewed him and then relied on his analysis and their own reporting to write an article with the title up there, How China Got Sri Lanka to Cough Up a Port. So many of the most important claims in the New York Times article are actually surprisingly wrong. I'll just mention 3. So the New York Times said that feasibility studies commissioned by the government had starkly concluded that a port at Hambantota was not economically viable. Well, that was not true of the Canadian feasibility study that we obtained. It's also not true of the second feasibility study that was conducted by a Danish firm, Ramboll. And Ramboll received the follow-on contract from Sri Lanka's Port Authority to design the master plan for the port. So this is the master plan that China Harbor followed in building the port, not some master plan developed in Beijing. So the New York Times also said that China retired Sri Lanka's debt in exchange for securing control of the property. That's not true. This was not a debt equity swap. Sri Lanka used the foreign exchange they received in the private-public partnership and the lease to bolster their foreign exchange reserves. They continue to service the debt, which never went into default. And most surprisingly, the New York Times wrote that initially moderate terms for lending on the port project became more onerous. If this was true, it would sound like predatory lending, but the exact opposite happened. The first Chinese loan in 2008 was at a commercial rate. It was negotiated at LIBOR plus a margin and converted into a fixed equivalent at 6.3% when LIBOR was trending upward right before the global financial crisis. 4 years later, when Sri Lanka applied for new loans for phase 2, they were issued at fixed rates of 2%. So the real story is that the terms got easier, not more onerous. This last point was particularly important for Meg Rithmeyer and me. But the New York Times reporters were apparently so convinced that China had deliberately laid a debt trap that they didn't notice that they themselves had changed the facts of the case to support their story. And 2 years later, the same reporting team were still misrepresenting the facts in the New York Times, writing in 2020, for example, when Beijing seized a strategic seaport in Sri Lanka as collateral. None of that happened. Debtor nations watch with concern. I went into some detail with the Hambantota story because it has deeply shaped how Chinese lending has been viewed by intelligent and well-informed people in and outside of Africa. We see echoes of it in Kenyan worries that China intends to seize Mombasa Port to pay the debts of the Chinese financed standard gauge railway. And the Trump administration, which surely had better intelligence than this, stoked these fears for political gains, relentlessly warning African nations that, as Attorney General Barr said, China was loading poor countries up with debt, refusing to negotiate terms, and then taking control of the infrastructure itself. So in the amount of time that I have left, I don't have time to go into detail about our ongoing research on how China's managing debt relief in debt distressed low-income countries today, but let me give you the outlines of some of what we're doing. To date, debt relief has largely been governed by rules set by the Paris Club, which is a cartel of official bilateral creditors. China is not a member of the Paris Club. We wanted to know what Chinese lenders did when their sovereign borrowers faced distress. So we started by putting together a database on all the cases that we could find of Chinese debt relief. There were almost 100 cases of debt cancellation, several dozen of debt restructuring. And then we studied them. We developed analytical narratives of all the information we could find of the times in which countries were in debt distress in some way or another, and the Chinese reacted to this. So there's 17 historic cases of this, including cases in Cuba and Iraq and other parts of the world, but primarily in Africa. And so we analyzed this. These are the 17 Africa cases here. And we found that there were a variety of different kinds of outcomes here. As you can see, sometimes the debt service payments were reprofiled within the original maturity. Sometimes there were maturity extensions. This was fairly common. Sometimes there was a reduction in interest rates. And then there were some where the details are not yet known. And so we found several other things that were of interest here. And the first is that there are multiple Chinese lenders. In our database, we already knew this because we find more than 30 Chinese entities providing loans in Africa. The majority are CIDCA, which is the new China International Development Cooperation Agency. They provide the interest-free loans that have been the only loans so far that we've seen, aside from Cuba and Iraq, that have actually been written off by the Chinese government. There's also China Exim Bank, China Development Bank, ICBC, Bank of China, and 25 other banks and companies. So this is a lot of different actors to coordinate. And we found that in addition, the debt relief was negotiated separately by these different entities. So it wasn't as though there's someone in Beijing coordinating everything. It was very disaggregated, very uncoordinated. We found that solutions were tailored. They were kind of bespoke arrangements so that no one solution looked like another solution. Sometimes it was at just the project level if a project was having trouble, as the Sri Lankans were having trouble in Sri Lanka with Hambantota. We also found that in Niger, they were having trouble with a Chinese finance refinery and so on. So sometimes these negotiations would be at the project level, sometimes it would be, but rarely at the level of the whole Chinese debt portfolio in a country. Extending maturity was the most common outcome. And as I mentioned, the write-offs were only for these interest-free loans, which was like a foreign aid tool of the Chinese government. Refinancing was rare. We only saw one case, and that was in Angola. And we saw no asset seizures at all, and no use of courts, even though Chinese loan contracts usually specify that arbitration should be the first choice of what to do in a debt distress situation. So this shows a table that we put together of debt cancellations in Africa, and you can see the different years from 2000 up to the present at which these spike. And that's more related to the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which is a group that meets every 3 years. And usually at that time, there's an announcement that there will be another round of debt write-offs for these interest-free loans. And that's what we found in our chart here. So in the pandemic era, the last part of our research is focusing on what's happening in the COVID-19 era. And this was really interesting because we see for the first time China joining a multilateral effort to provide debt relief. And so this is quite unusual. And we've been trying to determine just why China decided to do this, whereas in other efforts of the global financial architecture. For example, in export credits, China's been much more reluctant to join in with other countries to form a new set of global rules, but they're doing it with the debt relief processes. And so out of this, the debt service suspension initiative launched by the group of 20, China-Exim Bank has been active in 23 countries. So they provided some form of a temporary moratorium on debt service in those countries. And then CIDCA, the China International Development Cooperation Agency, which now manages the interest-free loans, they've done debt write-offs in 15 different countries, but this is not part of the DSSI. It's not part of the G20. And then we've also traced ad hoc debt relief, which very much resembles what the Chinese have been doing earlier in a number of countries. So in Ecuador, for example, 891 million in temporary debt service suspension, Angola and Venezuela, and so on. And I'll illustrate this, what's happening in the current era with examples from Angola and Zimbabwe. So Angola, because it's China's largest borrower in Africa, with $43 billion in loan commitments, and that includes some refinancing. So the actual debt outstanding is a little over 20 billion. And Zambia is unusual because it has the largest number of lenders. And I'm writing a paper about Zambia right now. I'm calling it Zambia's Chinese tragedy of the commons, because with all of these different entities looking to lend money to Zambia, companies, banks of different kinds, there's been nobody kind of coordinating this, and they've all been fishing in the same pond and actually overfishing. So it is like a tragedy of the commons. So, but in Angola, Chinese banks are responsible for about 39% of Angola's scheduled debt service this year. And about 55% is due to private lenders and bondholders of various kinds. And in January this year, the IMF published results of debt negotiations with 3 Chinese lenders, Exim Bank, China Development Bank, and Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. And they have negotiated 6.2 billion in debt relief, so suspension of interest and reprofiling of principal over the next 3 years with these 3 banks. And Angola also received some modest several $100 million in debt relief from other bilateral creditors, but they received nothing from other private creditors or bondholders. And the same thing is true in Zambia. Zambia became recently the first country to default to bondholders during the pandemic. And of their debt service due this year, 29% is due to Chinese lenders and 56% is due to private lenders and bondholders. And in November, China Development Bank and China-Exim Bank provided a short debt service moratorium to Zambia, quite along the lines of the DSSI. But the private lenders and bondholders have held back, so they haven't provided any debt relief to Zambia. So both of these cases illustrate the very real challenges of global cooperation to manage default risks in debtor economies. It's not clear how long China, which is the major bilateral creditor, but not the major creditor, is going to continue to provide debt relief if Western governments are unable to convince any of their private sector banks or bondholders to participate in this debt relief. So before I end, let me return to make a point about the business opportunities that European countries like France have been discovering with Chinese firms. Over the past 20 years, Chinese firms have learned a lot about how to play in an international construction business a business that remains dominated by Europe. Whereas China now has 27 firms among the top 100 global contractors, which is up from only 9 in 2000. Europe has 37, which is down from 41, but still very, very high. The United States only has 7, compared to 19 2 decades ago. So we are really withdrawing from that market. But Chinese firms are not the only companies to benefit from Chinese finance projects. We've been studying some of the relationships that Chinese companies are making with French companies in Africa. So for example, the French firms Bolloré and CMA-CGM have partnered with China merchants in China Harbor in port developments in Nigeria, Cameroon, and elsewhere. And I'll end with an example from Sri Lanka. So the UK-based engineering firm, Atkins Limited, led an international consortium recently hired by China Merchants Port that now has the lease in that private-public partnership in Hambantota. So Atkins Limited is part of the group writing the long-term plan for Hambantota Port and for the development of a new business zone there. And in an interesting turn of events, Atkins Limited is now owned by the Canadian firm SNC-Lavalin, which was the one Canada had been promoting more than 20 years ago at the origin of the Hambantota Port story. So in conclusion, let me say that the West gets a lot wrong about Chinese lending because real concerns about Chinese overexuberant capital exports between 2008 and 2013 and the impact these might have on debt sustainability are now deeply intertwined with the geopolitics of the US-China conflict. And secondly, we're only now beginning to do the hard work of deeply researching how Chinese capital operates overseas. So let me stop on that note and see what questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for the insightful and very informative presentation. I was always impressed by your energy and also the efforts that you have put for many years to collect all this micro data and to do forensic analysis, as you mentioned, about the port in Sri Lanka. So there are already quite a lot of questions in the Q&A room. So I'm going to go through them one by one later, but let me ask the first question, which is sort of related to my research with David Dollar and Wenji Chen, which you may still remember. And that is, we focus on foreign direct investment rather than loans. And as we know, Chinese financial and economic engagement can go through different channels, right? Obviously, some from the XM banks that you mentioned, some from the state-owned banks, some directly from the government, and they can take the form as loans with interest expectations, or they can go through the forms of foreign aid with basically no attachment to payback. And at the same time, there are lots of small, medium enterprises together with SOEs that are actually investing for profit, as described in the paper that I wrote many years ago. Something that we realize, and I want to confirm with you whether this is the same pattern that you find in your research, and that is there are lots of countries which had a huge infrastructure gap, and they need money from other countries to finance their projects. But unfortunately, due to political reasons, like low level of rule of law, or some governance issues, they could not get the loans from the World Bank and many other multilateral organizations. So therefore, China jumped in and helped them and invest in the projects. And as a result, if you look at the distribution of FDI from China versus FDI from the rest of the world, China's FDI appears to be more concentrated in countries that have a higher level of corruption, lower level of rule of law, and just in general, worse institutional development. So as a result, we have seen, as you also described briefly, that the Western media would describe, China is sort of empowering, some of those bad governing countries. So my question after a long remark is, did you find similar patterns in your research? And how could we respond, to those sort of negative sentiments or narratives about this situation, which is sort of created by this economic equilibrium that many of the Western countries could not invest in those less institutionally developed nations?
Well, there's so many different things in that question, Haywai, to unpack. And you're right, I think, to start by talking about all the different forms of finance that the Chinese government has available to it and that Chinese entities have available to them. So that there's a real difference between FDI and lending. So we find, for example, that the lending in Africa is dominated by Angola. And Angola is not particularly well governed. And so this is because the arrangement for the Angola lending is one really that the Chinese learned. They were first exposed to this back when Japan was first engaging in China, when China was not a creditworthy borrower. So Japan really wanted to get business for Japanese companies. This was back in the 1970s. And so they, together with the Chinese leadership, they arranged this line of credit from Japanese banks for $10 billion that China would repay with exports of oil and coal. And so then they would use this $10 billion to have Japanese companies come and develop the ports and the infrastructure and to help China with their 100 modernization projects. So that kind of model, Japan was really foresightful to go into what one can only consider really badly governed country. You know, China in 1978, just coming out of the Cultural Revolution, very unstable. Who would lend to a country like that? But Japan took that risk. And so I think the Chinese look at African countries as providing the same kinds of opportunities, so that if they provide finance and it's tied to the use of Chinese companies to carry out infrastructure projects, and the countries get to get infrastructure built, which they wouldn't be doing, no one else is lending them money for this. And the way that I look at it actually is that it's also an agency of restraint in places like Angola, where it actually forces some of their revenues from oil to be used for construction and public works projects, whereas they might have a lot of other competing demands for the use of that money, including embezzlement, which is always one option. But the way the Chinese system works is that the money stays within China, goes and pays the Chinese companies directly. So you find that kind of model that the Chinese look at, basically they're taking African governments the way they are, not the way that we might wish them to be. And they're saying it's still possible to do business in these countries, even though the risks are high. And they charge often for high risks. So there'll be insurance premiums on Sinosure. There are other ways in which those risks get accounted for. But at the end of the day, they are doing business. And as you found, the other thing about the natural resource sector is, of course, the countries that are better governed, and there aren't a huge number of resource-rich countries in Africa that one can point to and say they have really good governance. Think about which ones those might be. So there really aren't a lot of options when you're looking at natural resources and well-governed countries on the continent.
Great. There are 29 questions in the chat room. Many of them are similar. So let me go through them in order. So the first one is by Olga Botanko. And then she asked a very, very relevant question, in my opinion, and that is, a lot of this investment are related to government projects, and therefore a lot of those finance documentation would be confidential. So how did you deal with that potential sample bias that you are able to see that those projects that appear to be more transparent, more public, but there are lots of maybe sensitive projects that are not available to the public, and therefore your data set may not be able to capture those?
Well, we don't have contracts, loan contracts, for example. Our data set is about loan finance projects. And it's, for sure, I would say in a country like Sudan, our data is not as good. We were talking with the World Bank recently, and they also said their data for Sudan isn't very good, because Sudan has not been that good about reporting. The countries that go into arrears on their World Bank loans, for example, one of the things they stopped doing is reporting to the debtor reporting system there. So, our data relies on open sources and interviews. And it is surprising how much information there is available now about, and it's not that some projects would be sensitive they're pretty much, Chinese contractors are getting these projects and they're writing about them on their websites. They look at securing a project to carry it out as something that's part of their business. And so they want to advertise that they've done it. So there's a lot of information at ministries of finance now, because they don't have an incentive really to hide these infrastructure projects, because these are public works that they're doing, and they want the people of the country to know about them. So we don't have a lot of details on things like the terms of the loans, because a lot of that would be confidential. But we do have details on the magnitude of them. And again, our data isn't perfect, but we have teams of multilingual researchers going after this data, and they're pretty good. So and we're going to be announcing soon information that we've been able to determine based on our data and the World Bank's data, which is reported by borrowing governments. And it's interesting that our data and the World Bank's data are very, very close. So that also comforts me that whatever they're finding out, that we're pretty much finding it out also.
Great, good to know. There are a few questions about the negative perceptions about Chinese economic engagement in Africa, as well as in various Belt and Road countries. So the first question from the audience is, why would you think the negative perceptions are coming from? And second, how did the Chinese authorities respond to these negative perceptions in the West? Did they do anything at all, or what do you think they should do in order to address those negative sentiment towards their global economic engagement?
Well, the negative perceptions, I think they come from, let me say, two different places. One is a concern, which I think is quite legitimate, about debt sustainability. And so there's a relatively small number, but a significant number of borrowers, as pointed out with regard to Africa, that have borrowed too much. And their Chinese lending and their Chinese debt is not sustainable, nor is it from the other that have lent to those countries. And so in Asia, you can see this in Laos, for example. It looks like they're in trouble. We've seen it partly in Sri Lanka. We've seen it certainly in Africa, in the countries that I pointed out. We've seen it in Latin America and Venezuela. So there are a number of countries that have where the Chinese have gotten into trouble, and the borrowers are in trouble as well. So that's one area. It's not as widespread as people believe, but it is there. And then the second area is pretty much due to it's the concerns about corruption and the quality of projects, and concerns about whether countries have paid too much. And this goes down to the problem that a lot of these projects are not subject to competitive international bidding. Quite a few are. It's not at all the case that none of them, or that the Chinese won't fund projects that are subject to international tenders. That's not true. But quite a few are not subject to international tenders. And so then people always wonder, are they getting value for money? So those kinds of concerns, I think, underlie some of behind people's concerns about the Belt and Road Initiative. So the quality of the projects, are they getting value for money, and did they borrow too much? And then of course you have to overlay all of that, this relentless push of this debt trap diplomacy narrative that was it was coming from the last administration here in Washington very strongly. So that's also something, when you have a very powerful country continually repeating this theme, then that's also something that can worry people. And what have the Chinese responses been? Well, they've been kind of, they continue to say, we're not doing debt trap diplomacy, and the Belt and Road Initiative is welcomed by the countries where the Chinese are engaging. So they don't really have a very good PR team in Beijing to make their case on a lot of issues. They do continue to speak out about it, but it's not that effective. And I'm not sure how many people actually listen to them, because they speak out. They're not really known for pointing out their mistakes. and speaking frankly about mistakes. So that's why people don't necessarily listen to the spokespeople of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that closely.
Very nice. A couple of questions about Chinese investment in the Belt and Road countries, particularly those in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And I know your focus has been on Chinese investment in Africa, but did you also look at Chinese investment in other places, or do you plan to do that in the near future?
I'd really like to turn you over to my colleague, Meg Rithmeyer, and I wish she was here because Meg's really been doing much more work in Southeast Asia. So she's been working in Myanmar and Malaysia in particular. And then there's my colleague, Mike Lampton, who's just published a wonderful book about Chinese railways in Southeast Asia. And that's, it's a fantastic study. And he and his two co-authors have really looked very carefully at the whole sort of the financing package and the rollout and the different receptions of the high-speed rail projects in Southeast Asia. We are also holding a conference in April and May. It's sort of, you know, an online conference that's going to go on for 7 weeks. And we have a number of cases from Southeast Asia, and people are from around the world are presenting at that conference. So we also have some good paper by Erica Downs on Pakistan. So other people are analyzing Asia, Southeast Asia and South Asia. And I can, if you contact me, I can also put you in touch with others.
Great. Mike Lampton actually will speak in about a month in this webinar. So he just replied and agreed to do it. So I'm also very excited. So there's still a lot of questions. And interestingly, many of them are about the New York Times. And I have no idea why they are so concerned about the New York Times. I remember you wrote an article for the New York Times several years ago, maybe a couple of years ago. Based on this new research, they're interested in knowing whether the New York Times reporters have contacted you, or you have interest to write for them again to sort of clarify this myth about Chinese perhaps predatory lending to some of those countries that they described.
Well, what I published in the New York Times was an op-ed. So it was a couple of years ago. And I think it was in April 2019. So that's different. You know, you deal with the editorial team. It's different than the reporters. But the second time when the same reporting team, as I quoted them saying that debtor nations watched with concern as China, seized a strategic port in Sri Lanka as collateral. When I read that in their article, I thought, you know, I'm just going to contact them. So I emailed both of them. And I said, you know, this is not what happened in Sri Lanka. And I put them in touch. I showed them my work on Sri Lanka and Meg Rithmeyer's work on Sri Lanka. And one of the reporters was quite appreciative, and the other one was quite defensive. So, reporters are people too, and they don't like necessarily someone to point out that they didn't necessarily get it right. But, you know, they have such a platform. The New York Times, millions and millions of people read it. And, you know, we have how many people coming to this webinar? Well, maybe people will read the article that we did in the Atlantic. But I know both Meg and I, when we see that New York Times article, there's so many errors in it, and important ones. It just pushed us to write something that was we hope more accurate.
I'm sure some journalists who are listening right now will ask you to be interviewed or perhaps to write for them. So a couple more questions. One is something that I wanted to do for a long time, but I couldn't get hold to the right data sets. And that is your research, as well as many others, focus on the financial implications of loans and FDI and whatnot. How about the economic implications? And I remember in your Dragon's Gift book, I want to show it one more time here, or you cannot see it, and many other recent papers that you published also argue that Chinese economic and financial engagement in Africa did lead to positive impact on the local economies. Could you speak a little bit about your findings on perhaps workers training, knowledge transfer, or even development of economic zones? That is a question raised by my colleague Al Rees here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in The Dragon's Gift, which I wrote, it came out 12 years ago at this point, I was looking at the potential, a lot of the potential, because it was a more nascent relationship at that time. Of course, the Chinese had been active in Africa since 1960 and even earlier, but really the ramping up was happening around the 2005, 2006. That's when it started to become more visible. And so there were just so many different areas in which the Chinese are interested in engaging. Of course, infrastructure, as we've seen, is a huge part of that. But there was also manufacturing. And we just completed a 4 or 5 year project that was funded by the British, what used to be DFID, the aid agency in Britain, looking at Chinese manufacturing investment in 4 different countries. And we see in places like Ethiopia, it's provided a kickstart for local manufacturing, but it's not been the kickstart that I think everybody was hoping it would be. It was, the Chinese have been, and it could be that it's just going to take longer for this to happen. They've been building industrial zones, and we've seen this in Egypt. The first research project that I did on industrial zones focused on Egypt. So the Chinese zone there has been pretty successful, and it's been expanding. The ones in Ethiopia now, there are a number, not just the initial one. And we've also seen this in places like Nigeria. But there are other places like Zambia where the industrial zones have been kind of not really anything to write home about. But in our research, we looked at Chinese manufacturing investment, and really what the largest group is not sort of these export processing zones, but it's Chinese companies coming into African countries to produce in Africa what they used to be producing in China. So it's import substitution, but it's not the old model, you know, with these high protective barriers and overvalued exchange rates. It's producing in the local markets, things that used to be imported. And so we saw, for example, in Nigeria, there were Nigerian manufacturers that were learning from the Chinese and copying what they were doing and sort of taking, and they had some advantages because they already had the trading networks and the distribution networks that the Chinese didn't have. So there are some examples of that, of learning from China, but not nearly as many as one would like to see at this point. And our research, I think, the end result was that there was some technology transfer, but it remained more just at the level of labor and different kinds of skills training of labor. And still that level of the managerial level is still hard to crack. And it's not surprising. It's been very hard also for Western companies and the aid agencies to replace their Western workers at the high level or their aid workers with local people. That's taken a long time, and it's still not a complete process.
So maybe one more question, and then I will wrap it up. There's still a lot of interesting questions in the chat room. I tried to summarize them into 1 or 2. One of them is about AIIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. First, did your data set include those investments through AIIB? And second, how is AIIB being governed? And is it sort of influenced by the Chinese government to sort of complement some of the foreign aid and investment that you see in your data sets?
We wouldn't be tracking AIIB investments because we wouldn't consider those as coming from China. All of our data, all of our loan data, and I have to say that, you know, this word investment, I always find so problematic because it can refer to so many different things, you know, investment. But so AIIB also, even though some countries in Africa have joined AIIB, I don't know that AIIB has made any loans in Africa aside from Egypt. So I think there is a loan in Egypt, but you know, it's very hard for AIIB to loan outside of Asia. It has to be like a direct connection to Asia or of direct and large financial benefit to Asia. And so it's going to be hard for that to happen in Africa. In terms of AIIB, I think it's a learning opportunity for the Chinese. You know, they are the dominant shareholder there, just as the United States is the dominant shareholder in the World Bank. And so they're really, it's got, so far, I think the reputation of the AIIB is pretty sterling. You know, they've co-financed with the World Bank. They have very good standards. They've got, you know, you just don't see countries complaining about them. They're very careful in where they roll out their finance. So it seems to be doing a good job. However, you know, the majority of Chinese finance is not going through the AIIB, it's going through China Development Bank and China Export-Import Bank. So, and now the commercial banks are also really ramping up. We see this in Africa with ICBC and Bank of China in particular. So they're really looking for these large projects now.
We still have time for one more question, and I think this is an important one. Let me just read it out. Many of our audience are concerned about sustainability of those loans. Obviously, the focus in the West has been about debt trap and, you know, how those recipient countries will be able to pay back. But shouldn't we be concerned also about the sustainability for the Chinese government, meaning that many of these projects are very expensive. And we have already seen during the COVID incomplete projects or some debt cancellation or project cancellation. First, what do you think about that, you know, in terms of the financial burden on the Chinese government? And second, why did the Chinese government not choose to do something that is less expensive? For example, they can invite more young people from different countries to come to China to work, to study, to engage them in the Chinese society.
Well, to answer the last part of that first, they are doing that. The Chinese government has a very large number of scholarships in, particularly offered in Africa. And I think it's something like 50, could be 50,000. I have to double check the numbers there, but there is a very, very large number of Africans are being sponsored by the Chinese government to study in China. And not only that, so many are going there on their own dime. You know, they're paying for it themselves because they find the opportunity of studying in China to be attractive. So in terms of sustainability, this is a question that people in Beijing have been asking each other too, about the sustainability of this outward push. And what we see in our data is that Chinese lending in Africa, particularly from the policy banks, but overall, it really peaked. If you look at, if you take Angola out of the data, because Angola creates a lot of noise, it's sui generis, it's not like the others. But if you take Angola out, the lending actually peaked in 2013, which was the year that the BRI was announced. And then it's been going down since then. And so it's either been flat or going down. And we don't see it completely shrinking to nothing. For example, last year it was $7 billion. So, I mean, in 2019, it was $7 billion for Africa. But it has been going down. And I think that is as a result of the concerns about debt sustainability. And also, you know, it was responding to this, this surge from 2008 to 2013. There was this surge of Chinese excess of capital. And now there are needs for this at home. And so it's not, the same push factors aren't there as they were earlier. And so I think that's, there are global financial factors that determine how much money is going to be coming and how much is going to be going. But these concerns about debt, but also financial, environmental, social sustainability, Chinese project finance has a way to go before their ability to meet the highest global standards in those areas is before they can meet those. And so that's a big learning curve for Chinese banks and financiers as well.
Great, very good discussion with us. And I have to say, I tried to ask most of the questions from a chat room. There's still a lot that I couldn't manage to get through, partly because of a time constraint. But I think Professor Bräutigam has answered my questions very well. In addition to that, answer some of the questions that I didn't manage to deliver to you. So that was amazing, because you can read through our minds. I'm sure you have talked to a lot of people about these issues, and therefore expected some of the questions already. So thank you so much, Professor Bräutigam, for the wonderful presentation and discussion. It has cleared up a lot about our understanding and perceptions, I would say, about the situation. And we would like you to continue the work, including working with some of your co-authors about the Belt and Road initiatives. We know China-Africa is obviously very important and also very controversial issue, but at the same time, what is going on in Asia and specifically in Southeast Asia is equally exciting. So maybe I will ask your co-author, Meg, to give a talk in a few weeks.
She's great.
Yes, I can tell from the work with her. Once again, thank you. And I would like to promote the next event as well as talk a little bit about the AGI briefly. So first, our next speaker is going to be Danny Kwa, the Dean of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at NUS. He's going to talk about towards a new era of great power rivalry. You will be surprised about what he's going to say. He's going to walk you guys through a theoretical model and then try to shed light about the current obviously conflict between the two superpowers and also the implications for Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. Importantly, please follow us on social media. We are on every possible social media platform. Every week we have an Asia Global Online article published, on global and Asia Pacific economic and policy issues. But we have events, including this one, but also the quantitative history seminar that is going on every week. All right. Once again, thank you, Professor Deborah Bräutigam, for the presentation and discussion. Stay healthy. We look forward to meeting you in person here in Hong Kong. I can tell from the Q&A chat room, many of them wanted to invite you to come to Hong Kong to share your insights and have more in-depth face-to-face interactions.
It was a pleasure, Haywai. Thank you for inviting me.
Great. Bye for now. See you next time.